Good morning. Or not, as the case may be. Sorry, I thought it was good morning. Apparently it isn't. I must be behind on the news. So just want to talk to you. I've just been introduced as an anthropologist. I just want to explain very, very quickly the difference between anthropology and archaeology. I'm just getting constantly harassed by people after I've spoken about they found a bone in their backyard and did I know what it was. So I just want to make it very clear I'm not an archaeologist. Archaeologist specializes in dead culture. So if you have archaeologists turn up at your place of work, it means you're in trouble. Anthropologists specialize in living cultures, so we're actually interested in how well are you doing, what's keeping you alive, how vibrant you are. The key skill that most anthropologists are trained in is a thing called participant observation, or as my children like to call it, professional voyeurism, which basically just gives us permission to go and meet people, sit amongst them for any period of time. It can be anything from weeks to years in some cases, and just observe that the cultures that they've created for themselves, how they're operating, how they form, who leads the culture, and how adaptive that culture is, and what are the, if you like, the collaterals of the culture in terms of the changing world around them, or in the business world in terms of how we're interacting and meeting with customers, or even competitors, and whether we're able to respond to those challenges quick enough. It's an area that's become increasingly important for organizations to pay attention to. You may have heard that Procter & Gamble's accountants just last year came back having looked at the positioning and the adaptability of Procter & Gamble's culture and anticipated that Procter & Gamble worldwide was in the position of probably losing about $16.3 billion worth of new revenue streams over the next 36 months, simply because their culture would not be able to adapt to those opportunities quick enough. So what's happened around the world is culture's suddenly become something that used to be considered namby-pamby, new age, hug a tree, and definitely left just to the HR practitioners, whereas now what's happening is it's actually considered to be risk management, and risk management in a fairly significant way. So what I'd like to do with you today is just to share some of the observations I've had around organizational culture over the 30-odd years I've been doing this, and particularly link it to the topic that obviously you're all here to explore and talk about and play with, which is the customer experience and what that might look like if a culture is working for you, what it might look like if it's not. More importantly, I'd like to focus in towards the tail end of the talk I'm going to share with you today on what leadership's role is in terms of leading a culture that anticipates and responds well to customer experience and creates that in the first place. So just before I get started, can I just have a show of hands, because there's many different ways of doing this. I've just been asked to talk a little bit longer than had originally been asked for, and I'm happy to do that. In fact, I'm delighted to do that, but I just want to see the level of interest so I don't overstay my welcome, if that's all right. So based on what I've just said, can I just have a show of hands of how many of you are in organizations that believe that sort of conversation around the role of culture in terms of customer experience is one that's important to your organization? Sure. Oh, fabulous. The overwhelming majority. I'm so relieved because I had nothing else planned to talk about, so that's great. Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to start off with a fairly obvious kind of statement. One of the things I just want to talk about before we get into the detail is why culture is important in the first place. And the reason I prefer to start all talks with this is over the years I've found that most organizations have a culture, obviously. They're quite happy to talk about the culture and even use the word culture, but with the greatest respect, I've found many of them actually have a very, very shallow or even naive understanding of what culture actually is and where it comes from and how it forms. So I just want to quickly clear up a couple of points that I think would be worthwhile exploring before we venture into more detail. So the first of those is that most organizations refer to culture as the way we do things around here. Have you heard that term? Which is not a bad sort of start if you're not familiar with culture. In reality, in anthropological terms, it's not a very useful definition at all. In fact, the way we do things around here in organizations typically describes more accurately your strategy or your processes or your systems. So if we understand what culture is in terms of real terms, it's not the way so much as the why. So culture literally is why people respond and behave the way they do inside your organization. It's not the way they're doing it. That's just, if you like, a surface element of it. To truly understand what culture you've got and how it's operated and formed in your organization, you need to delve deeper into that and understand why people are behaving this way. So what that enables us to do is to start to get some real in-depth understanding of the culture that's formed rather than just a surface measurement. And unfortunately, most organizations still fail to understand this. Hence, you'll see things like engagement surveys are still popular in the 21st century, despite the fact we've known that culture doesn't operate around that. And so one of the fascinating things I've found over the years is I believe that most tribal cultures are far more effective than most organizational cultures. Because tribes obviously put a lot of emphasis on culture. They're dependent on it for their own future. And the interesting thing is, although those cultures work far more effectively, it seems that organizations haven't really paid any attention to it or responded to it. So for example, in the 40-odd tribes I've spent time with over many, many years in different countries, not one of them uses an engagement survey. Or needs to, right? And you kind of go, yeah, it's kind of obvious when we say it, isn't it? And we all laugh, but you suddenly go, so what's that all about? Well, my kind of blunt opinion is that inside organizations, we're so distracted from people, the people conversation, both our customers, believe it or not, and our employees, that we have to get external people to come in and talk to our own people to find out how they feel about being here. But just think about that as a dynamic alone. There's something wrong with that, isn't there? A, we don't know. B, we're not really interested because we're going to get someone else to do it. And C, we have to use someone else's language to understand our own tribe. So it's a little bit flawed, and I suggest to you the best organizations I've seen in terms of delivering extremely high levels of customer service don't use engagement surveys. They replace it with a thing called internal conversations. Literally just people walking around, particularly the bosses, the supervisors, and the leaders saying, how you going? What's the biggest challenge you got at the moment? Is there anything else I can do to support you? Is there anything that you're experiencing that I need to be aware of that could make your life better, easier, and give you more time and attention to dedicate to the customer? That time, those conversations are usually far more effective in increasing the customer experience than running your annual engagement survey. So I know that's a little bit provocative, and I understand you've got time to discuss the presenter's information at the end. That's definitely one I'd be encouraging you to have a think about. What role does engagement survey play? Because my experience is it gives you people's opinion of the culture. It tells you nothing of the culture itself. So culture's happening on a day-to-day basis in the moment, and I'll come back to that point shortly. And you, as leaders in organizations, need to know what those moments are all about and what they're doing and how they operate. This has become very, very powerful. And you'll see that, in fact, I believe culture has become, if not your leading competitor, then pretty close to it. And you will have heard the news just last month of Toyota pulling out of Australia in 2017. I don't know if you saw the president's comment when he was asked why. His primary reason for pulling Toyota out of Australia, he said the culture's too hard to work with. And he wasn't talking about Australian culture, he was talking about Toyota Australia's culture. It's just become so disconnected from the strategy and the systems and processes that Japanese are famous for operating with that it's too hard to work with. So they're going to pull out and go elsewhere. You also think about places like Enron. Enron was not put out of business by its major competitors in the marketplace. It collapsed through its own culture. And so increasingly, this stuff's become very, very powerful. It acts very, very quickly, and it's got extremely high levels of stealth. If you don't know what culture is and know how to look for it, it'll actually work on your organization's future before you're even aware that it's become a problem. And again, an annual engagement survey is a history lesson in terms of how your culture went bad 12 months ago and now you're broke. So the more you can be in touch and in the moment, and this applies to customers as well, the more you're able to adapt in the moment and respond with greater agility. Is this all making sense? Cool, all right, good, good, good. So, having looked at that, just want to look at what is the connection between organizational culture and the prospect of service. And this is kind of an interesting one because there's a very organic human thing going on here. We form cultures for eons. I'm often asked, you know, oh, this talk on culture, is this just the latest business trend? And my response to that is no, actually, business is just the latest cultural trend, right? We've been culturing for tens of thousands of years. Business, in its format that we operate now, is literally 400 years old. Most of your organizations, if you're a limited liability organization or a corporation, are based on the British East India model, which developed in 1601 on January the 1st. So we're relatively new at the business side, but the culture bit's been going on forever. And there's some very, very simple, powerful things to be aware of around culture in terms of looking at how human beings actually operate organically. If you're going to put a business template on top of that, you need to understand what that culture thing looks like. So fundamentally, the best way of explaining it is almost, you're all familiar with Aesop's fable, The Lion and the Four Oxen? If you're not, let me quickly remind you, because it may have been a while. Basically, the story is a lion came into a paddock on a daily basis. There was 4 oxen in the paddock, and the oxen used to form a circle by putting their tails together, very much like the image on the screen here. And by doing so, no matter which angle the lion came in at, it met not only a pair of horns in front of it, but it was also in danger of having 2 pairs of horns on either side. So the lion would circle and growl in frustration every day and disappear because it couldn't do anything. Eventually, as is all Aesop's fables, they have a moral at the end of them. The moral of the story was that eventually one of the oxen decided it was superior and didn't need to play these silly games, and so it refused to participate in the circle. which meant the circle actually became fractured and they got distracted and argued about how arrogant the other oxen was, which gave the lion the opportunity to come in, and the story goes that he picked off all 4 lions over the following week. Human beings have observed this going on in nature every time they went out hunting and gathering. They would either see a lion approaching antelope, or they themselves would hunt buffalo or bison, and the animals would circle. So even in those ancient times, human beings started to see that creating a circle and bonding together gave you the greatest chance of survival and protection. And it was something that was kind of stuck in our memory, and we began to explore. And so what you'll see even in tribes and cultures all around the world is we organically, look at the table you're sitting at right now, human beings, whenever you get into the groups, will form circles. And they will form select circles. So you can even go into organizations. I regularly go to conferences like this, either as a speaker, but I often get hired as an anthropologist for the 3 days, just to sit in and watch your tribe. And you can literally see just how many people form in circles, what your natural team dynamics are in your organization. Does that make sense? So you wait till everyone's having cocktails in the evening, you stand around and just observe, and if you see people in groups of 3s or 5s, is the average and the norm, that tells you what your ideal team should be in culturally. It's not a conscious decision, it's not on the HR planning chart, it tells you organically what that culture best operates with. My suggestion is you start to rethink organising those teams around those numbers, and what we found, give you a case example, we did this at Keynote's Hire, who you're probably all familiar with, the nationwide brand, just recommending what size teams they needed operating on the court, 4 courts, to deal with customers based on how the guys were socially interacting every time they had a conference and a couple of beers together. So this organic stuff is sitting there. The more we mess with it, the more problems we run into in terms of organising people's performance and productivity. The more we go with the flow of what the culture is actually doing, the better performances we're going to get out of it. And every organisation you see perform at an extremely high level does this, either deliberately or by fluke, and it doesn't really matter as long as you're actually paying attention to the culture in the first place. So not only do we form circles when we get together, we also used to sit around the fire at night, right? Which meant that each and every one of us in the tribe would have gone off and done something different during the day. I might have been hunting, you might have been gathering water, you might have been gathering firewood. And it's only when we came back together and sat around the fire at night, I'd hear the trials and the tribulations that you'd been through today, fighting off the black mamba and you fighting up the warriors from the other tribe, and I would start to respect you for the effort and the time you put in, even though I didn't work in your department. So if any of you, I know none of you have sort of experienced this right now in the organizations you work with currently, but if any of you worked with organizations previously that suffered from silo mentality, have you heard of this thing? I know you don't get it now, but the previous organizations, that's when culture's gone bad, right? You've forgotten that you're human beings together. So this stuff's very, very powerful and worthwhile paying attention to. You'll even see that the dwellings from tribes all around the world copy the symbol of circles. Everywhere you go in the world, it's a very organic shape that people copy because they get what it actually means, the symbolism of it. You will also see that we created villages based on the same model all around the world. Now, the reason I'm sharing all this is not to give you a history lesson, but start to say this stuff's been going on for thousands of years. When you drag it into an organization and try and stick a triangular shape on top of it, right, you're messing with nature. And nature doesn't like to be messed with, in case you haven't noticed, with climate change, etc., right? The more we can work harmoniously with what goes on organically, the better performance we get. Even mythologies all around the world in cultures, your Aboriginal cultures here, the Maori culture at home, the Celtics, the Tibetans, the Mayans, all of them have embraced the circular of culture and the power that actually brings of actually working together and connecting effectively with other people. So what does it look like in real business terms? Let's finish the anthropology history review. It looks like this. Inside each and every single culture on the planet, and I'm talking everybody from the Zulu to Girl Guides to your organization to Google, every single culture operates on 3 underlying dynamics. One is you're trying to control something. And normally what you're trying to control is the circumference of the circle. Is it protected? Do we have enough fences up? Have we got our horns in place? Or in marketing terms, it's what does our brand look like? When somebody comes into touch, how welcoming, rewarding, and receptive is that experience for them? The second thing we try and control is the relationship we have with ourselves and amongst the people in the tribe, but also the tribe's relationship with the outer world and whether we're relating to it effectively enough and changing and adapting quick enough. And even as organizations as powerful and as impressive as Procter & Gamble are having problems with this. Yeah, their inner formation of the circle is not making them adaptive enough in the world around them. And then finally, the third element of every single culture on the world is the extent to which you are developing, changing, and adapting to the world around you. And if you've ever heard that expression, but we've always done it this way, you realize that that circle's become very, very cemented and structured, and it probably means you're going to be in trouble in the future. So the combination of the control, relate, and develop, what I'd almost encourage you to do, if this is of any interest to you, is play amateur anthropologist when you go back into the workplace. Just over the next 7 or 8 days, carry a little notebook around you. I give you full anthropological permission to do this. Carry a little notebook around you and just look for the evidence of where your organization's trying to control something. It could be cash flow. It could be debtors. Right? It could be absenteeism. It could be performance through 360s. Look at how you're trying to relate, and that'll be obviously areas that are very familiar to a lot of you in terms of how you're relating to your customers, but also internally, things like, go look, is there evidence of silo mentality showing up with inside your organization? And the third area is what's going on development-wise. And I'm not just talking about R&D. I'm not just talking about the processes that come out of R&D. I'm actually talking about the individual growth of human beings within the company. In other words, is your organization developing its people effectively enough? And the reason you want to pose that question is just pose this question to yourself. Can your organization grow commercially if the people inside it don't? Right? So can your business commercially grow, say within the next 12, 24 months, if the people inside it don't personally grow? Change their attitude, increase their awareness, get over themselves, drop some of the arrogance, some of the habitual behaviors that are no longer serving them, etc. So it's a very powerful consideration to take and explore. So just go play amateur anthropologist in those 3 areas and you start to reveal the culture you have created, which may not have been necessarily what was designed or even intended. But it gives you a reality check of what's going on. How does this all play out? Hopefully you can't read this because I don't want you to get too distracted. There's some real science behind this, so I'm not just making up kind of anthropological mythology here. There's 128 human values that we know of that comprise and are common in cultures all around the world. So those 128 values fall into those 3 categories. A group of those values are about having a sense of control, controlling the food supply, water, timber, livestock, trade, etc. Traditionally, nowadays it's things like controlling cash flow, revenue, etc. The second value, as I said earlier, about relating, how you choose to relate to each other. Is that arrogantly? Is it you choose to relate through competition, or do you choose to relate through cooperation, empathy, creativity, etc.? And the third area is development values. What are the values you've selected as the touch points through which you are going to push yourselves, explore yourselves, grow yourselves, and extend yourselves? Getting the right combination of those mix of values inside your culture will literally dictate whether you're still here in a decade or not, and it will dictate how many of your customers are with you over the next 36 months. Because if that is out of alignment with where the market's values are, you start to get ditched in favor of somebody that's got a better alignment. So I know it sounds sort of hidden and touchy-feely, but this is actually what drives economics. So sitting fundamentally under this whole global economic are human values. And a human value is simply this: your preference, what would you prefer to experience, multiplied by how important for you is it to experience that. So your personal human values are based on what would you prefer to experience. So let me give you an example. How many of you would prefer to be healthy? Show of hands. Yeah, me too, right. Multiply the priority you place on it. In other words, if I've been filming you with a video camera, grabbing ethnographic research over the last 48 hours, how much evidence would I have on film now that you are serious about that health, right? Now, immediately some of you are going, oh, no, that's not fair. I'm at conference, I'm away from the family and the missus. Well, my boyfriend's back there, right? So I don't normally drink that much. And I normally go for a triathlon training run every morning. This is my chance to have a lie-in and go to the spa, right? So what we're really saying is, how are you living your life? Is it in prioritization of your preferences, or are you doing something different? Because this is the difference between strategy, the promise you're making to your customers and brand, and culture, which is actually what gets delivered on a day-to-day basis. And it's very, very rare for an organization to have its culture completely in alignment with its strategy. The priority is completely in alignment with the preferences. When you get that, magic happens, and you become world famous as an organization. And every organization you've heard of that is world famous for performing well and treating its people well has done exactly that. Match strategy to culture. The moment you haven't, you have all sorts of challenges, all sorts of problems, and all sorts of financial restrictions placed on you. So where does this take us all, and what does it mean in terms of sort of strategic implication? And is there a real connection between culture and strategy? Well, you just heard that it's talking about that the cultural elements of control, relate, and develop are real. If you're familiar with the discipline of market leaders, that's the work by Fred Weiss-Surma, Michael Tracy. Back in the 90s, they talked about fundamentally there are 3 business strategies: operational excellence, customer intimacy, and product leadership. Operational excellence delivers best price to market. Customer intimacy delivers best service to market. Product leadership delivers best product to market. What we know is that those are only sustainable as strategic options for your organization, and the tricycle there is to represent all organizations have a combination of all of those three strategies, of course. You can't run a business without all three being present. The trick is to choose which one is your lead front wheel that's going to direct you in terms of where you're going into the marketplace. The problem is it's the culture that sits on the tricycle and pedals. So strategically, when you go, we're all about customer intimacy and we're going to have a nice back-end operation looking after the accounts, we've got a tiny little research and development here just to tweak the products every now and again. If the culture is not actually aligned, in other words, it doesn't have its focus on the same front wheel that your strategic plan does, guess what? Sorry, that's not a rhetorical question. Yeah, the tricycle goes off on its own little journey, or the cyclist gets off and walks away, right? Or they only pedal with half the energy, and if your competitor's pedaling with more energy, you lose. So the combination of these two factors is absolutely critical, making sure you've got the right mixture of control, relate, and develop lined up with your strategy. Because each and every one of those impacts on, of course, customer experience. If you're promising customer intimacy, but you developed a control-freak culture, right, customer intimacy goes down the toilet. Just talk to Microsoft, they'll tell you what the history of that. Right? Just lost contact with the marketplace. Heavily influenced on what they've been controlling and developing, right, but missed where the market was going. That's tragic, right? Because what a contribution Microsoft made to the planet. Do you remember the early days, the breakthroughs? We were in awe, weren't we? It's just amazing, and you can see how quickly they can just drift off just by not having your eye on the ball and connecting the two up effectively. So let me give you a case study of this. I'm just going to talk about the GFC. I'm from New Zealand, so I know a lot about this. We've had a GFC. I think the world's claim the GFC started in 2008, if I remember. Early warning signs 2007. Of course, New Zealanders were ahead of the game. We've had our GFC going on for nearly 200 years now. So I'm fully qualified to talk about this. I think Australia's only just realised what GFC means in the last 12 months. If from what I'm hearing, your dollar's I think our dollar's on the same exchange rate at the moment. It's incredible. So I understood, when I kept looking across the ditch at you guys, thinking GFC must stand for getting finance from China. And so I think you're getting a bit of reality check now. So I'm just here from New Zealand to share with you some war stories about a GFC and what's coming for you. Culture has a significant role to help you get through that. It's exactly what we've done in New Zealand. Most of the organisations is pull together, get really focused, you can make it through. So hopefully this is a hopeful story, not a sad story for you. So GFC, what's happened? Again, participant observation. What I did was I travelled the world looking at how organisations respond to a challenge outside of their tribal circle. In this case, it was a global economic one. So what we found was most organisations responded to the GFC with some of these types of processes and approaches. So they started outsourcing. How many of you got an organisation that's done some of that over the last 5 or 6 years? Yeah, a good number of you, okay. They started retrenching. I think that's HR's cover-up code for sacking people because we can't afford to pay you anymore. How many of you have been through that over the last 5 or 6 years? Yep. Oh, some of you look worried when you did that. Maybe it's still going on. My apologies. Didn't mean to remind you. Automation. How many of you had new technology brought in to replace the old way of doing it? You've gone from paper or stone to carvings to computers, etc., and apps, and yep, likewise, right? And then also restructuring. And this is the classic one, isn't it? Decentralised or centralised, depending on what decade it's in. Because about every 10 years we change our mind, don't we? The banks are geniuses at this, aren't they? Going out to the suburbs and the outer regions? No, we're not. Oh, yes, we are. No, we're not. And so, yeah, it's just difficult to keep up with. So that all look familiar? How many got clients that have been through the same thing? Yeah, me too. Most of my clients have been struggling with this over the last decade. Here's the interesting thing about it. All it actually delivered was greater efficiency. So all those activities, from a customer's perspective, because this is what we're here to talk about, all actually delivered was efficiency. Kept you in the game, which is good, right? Because you're still here, you're still alive. The tribe didn't die with the line circling, the economic line circling on the outside. So you kept yourself alive and good on you. Well done. But the problem is, from the customer's point of view, no additional value was added. You just were efficient. And the problem with that was, guess what all your competitors were doing? This stuff as well, right? So you've got no further ahead. There's no distinguishing advantage of doing business with you as a customer than anyone else out there. And so the problem with that is, in the world we live in, with the techno-wizardry we're all exposed to on a regular basis, unfortunately customers expect efficiency. It's entry to market, right? If you don't have that, you shouldn't be playing the game anyway. And it's because of these sort of gadgets. Just think of your grandparents' time, having the gadgets that we have now in our hand and the things we can do in our hand now. Makes sense, right? So customers are used to having efficiency literally in the palm of their hand now. So if your organization can't even play that game, they immediately start to write you off. They expect efficiency. So all that effort, all that money, all that time we've spent just getting more efficient by outsourcing, restructuring, etc., has just left us still at ground zero. We're no further ahead. So what are customers looking for from cultures nowadays in modern organizations? If it's not efficiency, we've got to have efficiency, but if it's not what they're looking for, what are they looking for? Well, again, my observation is empathy and creativity are the two areas that customers are hungry for. Empathy because they're in pain. They're hurting, just like the businesses are. They've been bleeding. They've found it tougher than it's ever been. A lot of their aspirations went down the toilet over the last 6 years. Their dreams were smashed. You know, they had to alter them. And again, you may not be familiar with all this going on in Australia because it's still, you were relatively protected. This is what's been going on. Go and ask to any European how much pain they've been in over the last decade, they'll tell you. They've got war stories like you wouldn't believe. And Sydney, New Zealand got the same thing. So this empathy factor is coming, and it's coming big time. So that means your frontline staff and touch points of your business need to be empathetic in a way they have never done before. You've got to reignite the empathy flame and even explain what that means. If you're not sure what the empathy means, a lot of people get it confused with sympathy. Empathy is when you have, I have your pain in my heart. That's the definition of empathy. It's actually a Lakota Sioux Indian word. Your pain in my heart. Have you heard the expression, oh, I feel you, brother? You hear people do that? Kind of hip on the street. Yeah, I feel you. That's empathy, right? As long as they're not just saying if they actually do feel you, I feel your pain, right? That's what we're aiming for. So we've got to be experiencing that, got to be expressing that, especially if you're selling and marketing to anything to people. You've got to explain, before you start saying, here's my new gadget, right? Here it is, awesome, check it out. Right? What I've got to do before I can have that conversation with them, I've got to frame up, I know the pain you're in. Right? I know the suffering that's going on for you, and therefore we put time and effort into considering that, and we came up with this for you. That's a conversation that's going to be coming, right? Just till we get out of this whole economic and political crisis that's going on around the world. So the creativity is coming up with the ideas which you're good at. That's your whole market. That's what you're all about. And mixing with the empathy, you've got a really good chance of emerging ahead of the pack, especially if any of your competitors didn't buy the ticket to come to this conference and listen to these types of conversations, get the thinking cap on. That's going to be the difference between being here in a decade and not. Here's the other point. Customer service and service experience is not process and systems. This is the big wake-up call. If you really want to master, if you want to knock the ball out of the park on customer experience, service and that experience happens in the moment, and it happens through the limbic brain. It's a sensory experience, right? Hear, smell, touch, feel, right? Happens here and now. So again, having the best automated system behind the scenes is not what it's all about. When I checked out of a hotel recently overseas, I could do it all automatically through an app. I didn't even need to go down to the front counter, right? I can just check out and say, right, this is what I had from the minibar. Hit the button and they'll invoice me later off my credit card, right? No human interaction at all. But that's not what made the hotel impressive for me. What made it impressive for me was the people that came in to clean my room every morning and the genuine appreciation they had for me and what I do, right? And here's the interesting thing, it was overseas, you could almost argue third world country, so I'm earning squillions more than they will ever earn in a lifetime, the sad reality of globalization. But the way I got treated was, they actually, you almost felt the empathy that they had for someone like me that has to spend a lot of time traveling away from home. Does that make sense? That's the feeling I got from them. There was almost a look of, you poor thing. Right, 5-star hotel, customer paid for it, I didn't even have to pay for it, I just had to cover the minibar bill, which in my case is tiny. Right? But the reaction I got was, oh, you poor thing. To be stuck in a hotel, right? So while you're here and suffering the way you are, sir, we're going to make it an experience that you'll never forget. That's empathy. You know, that's the lingering. I will go back to that hotel over and over and over again, not because of the app, but because of the people that came in to clean my room every morning or help me with my dry cleaning. Do you get the idea? It's the moments, those magical moments, the human touch human. Make sense? It's not high tech, it's high touch. Those are the magical moments you're going to be thinking about, right, in your old age when you're reflecting back on when life was good. It's the high-touch moments that will come to mind. I promise you. Years ago, I was put in a rather frightening situation, being told I had 36 hours to live. I had cerebral malaria, and got a really big wake-up call on this. It's the human touch moments that are the ones that you linger on in the last, right? They're how you measure yourself. And I believe they're how we should be measuring our businesses, interaction in community and society as well. So how do you create service in the moment? How do you lead that? It's very simple. You've got to move from triangles to circles. Because we lead organizations from the top of the triangle, don't we? Don't we? High office, the title, the salary, better car position, top of the triangle. I got the power, dude. Treat me with respect. It's all about pride and status and symbolism. That's a great way to run the military. It's even a really good way to run a surgical unit in a hospital. It's just a terrible way to build a culture that responds really empathetically and creatively with massive customer experience. What you want to be doing is leading from the center of the circle, the heartbeat of the whole place. Remind people this is a human endeavor before it's a business endeavor. I have a sneaking suspicion, hate to share this with you, I have a sneaking suspicion fundamentally organizations actually don't like people. I reckon if they could do away with them and still make the profit, do you know what I mean? Right? Didn't have to employ anybody, didn't have to deal with unions, didn't have to deal with customers, didn't have to deal with supply chain management. If you can manage all that and the dollar still came in, how cool would that be? It's kind of missing the point, isn't it? Don't you think? Because my perspective is you're all modern tribes. You're the equivalent of society's tribes now. You probably spend more time in your workplace culture than you do in your family culture or your Australian culture. Is that true? If your boss is in the room, nod vigorously now. You see the hours I put in last week alone, boy. True? So if I come and look at you as an anthropologist, you're a modern tribe. Head of the organization's called what? CFO. What does the C stand for? Chief, tribe, right? Cultural. CFO is the witch doctor. He is. He's the modern equivalent, right? Witch doctors used to look through the bones to predict the future. Oh, bad hunting season come. We hunt now, right? Bones look bad. It's the same as the spreadsheet. Isn't it? Oh, bad quarter, not looking good. Get out and sell more now, right? IT are the drummers. They're just building very sophisticated drums that can go, instead of across the valley, what do they do now? Across the world. But we're still sending messages and listening to the response, aren't we? Aren't we? Sales reps are warriors, right? They just replace spears with laptops and iPads. I'm not joking. You go and break it down, right? We haven't advanced as much as we thought we had, which is kind of cool on the one hand and disappointing on the other. I'll let you figure out which is which. All right, so that's what we're trying to do. Get out of your neocortex and more into your limbic brain. Right. Biggest thing you can do as a leader to inspire customer intimacy and customer experience is say hello to your employees as a leader every morning without fail. You can spend 50 minutes, forget your appointments and your to-do list, spend 15 minutes a day getting around as many of your employees as you can saying, good to see you here again. Thanks so much for the effort yesterday. I heard some great stuff about you. Or I heard you had a tough day yesterday. I hope that doesn't happen for you today. If there's anything I can do, let me know. Right. Love working with you. Really simple conversations. Guess what happens? I'm not making this up. This isn't business philosophy. This is biology. You release oxytocin through the system of the other person. Have you heard of oxytocin? Ladies will be familiar with it, right? You give birth, oxytocin is the drug that floods you, that makes you fall in love with this ugly, screaming little thing covered in blood. And you change from being mother to lioness instantly, don't you? Don't mess with me and the baby, right? That's oxytocin. It's bonding instantly. Job as a leadership, culturally and anthropologically, the definition of leadership is release oxytocin through the tribe. Make people feel like they belong here, that they have a role to play, and that you have noticed. You have witnessed their effort and their endeavors. So here's my summary. You want to build a culture that can respond well to the marketplace, touch people, move them, create loyalty and magical moments, magical customer experience moments. This is how you do it. You turn up and you remind people about what we do here, make them believe. It's not the profit conversation, right? It's the service conversation. We're here to serve Australians or our market through. Second thing you do is you talk about what's appropriate behaviour and what's not inappropriate behaviour around here. And you tell the stories about the appropriate behaviours. Right? And you share them publicly. Just want to share Mary's story from yesterday. She served a customer who was angry, and this is how we responded. Good on you, Mary. That's what we're looking for around here. Right? This is how tribes pass on what they call cultural memes. The stories become the messages about how you make the culture more effectively. And then finally, as a leader, you should be constantly talking about belonging. Look at that word, it's be long. Be human for a long time. Make sense? Because there's cultures even now, I don't know if you're aware, in traditional cultures, they're dying at the rate of one every fortnight. In other words, they're being, but it's not going to be for long. One every fortnight. Just so vulnerable, right? Can't adapt quick enough and haven't done enough work. So those are the three things. Help your people believe what they're doing is worthwhile, believe in the customer, believe we've got a role to play, talk about the behaviours that are appropriate and inappropriate, and be very strong in that conversation. Not bullying, just strong. That's inappropriate behaviour. We don't operate like that around here. Go work for the opposition if you need to. but we don't do that around here, and talk about what it takes to belong here. What do we need to be doing in the future? What do we need to be doing differently? How do we need to change what we're doing? Give me feedback as your leader of the things I should be changing that would help us get to where we want to be quicker and over a longer period of time. What do those three things do? You'll see on the slide up there, they deliver the two fundamentals of any culture that's going to make it in the world. Trust and safety. Safety is, how safe is it for people to converse in your culture? How safe is it for the customers to tell you what they really feel? Because you know what most customers are like, right, when they've had a bad experience? They don't tell you, do they? Right, so if you want to get better, those are the conversations your customers need to feel safe having with you. I've got a problem with your product. I've got a problem with your pricing. You let me down. The service was late. If you're getting those criticisms coming back, it means your culture's safe. If you're not, you're already dying. You just don't realize it. The market will leave you alone. Yeah, just move away. Move into another paddock. And then the trust element as a leader, you've got to be seen to be trustworthy, and that's that daily exposure, the oxytocin. People only trust people if the oxytocin's been released. Right? So how you do that is just remind them on a human level, I'm pleased to be here with you. I'm pleased to be supportive of you. I will do anything for you. Simple conversations, but for human beings, they work. So that's all I've got. I hope that's been of some interest and some value to you. There's some information up on the slide up here. There's a new piece of IT that's come out called Mobbit, which basically means SMS, that word tribal to the number there. If you want to stay in this conversation and want more information, we can get that to you. Likewise, the website's got a whole bunch of free information on there. If this is a conversation you want to continue back in your organization, please feel free to do that. I'd be delighted. As we say at home, kia kaha, which means be forever strong. Thanks so much.